The next major step in the development of Soviet jet aviation was closely tied to acquiring what were then the latest centrifugal flow engines from Great Britain. On March 11, 1947, the Soviet Council of Ministers issued a decree. Under this directive, several design bureaus were ordered to simultaneously develop entirely new types of aircraft. These aircraft would be built around this British technology. Specifically, the team led by aircraft designer Alexander Yakovlev was tasked with creating a frontline fighter. This aircraft would feature a conventional straight wing. The heart of this fighter was going to be the Derwent 5 engine. It produced 3,582 pounds of thrust. But why did they decide to go with a straight wing? Aviation was already moving quickly toward new technologies. There were a few reasons for this. First, Yakovlev's personal preferences likely played a role. At the time, he viewed the swept wing with skepticism. Yakovlev had influence within the government, and because of this, it was relatively easy for him to push through technical decisions in his favor. Second, building this kind of conventional fighter gave the aviation ministry an insurance policy. The competing designers Artem Mikoyan and Semyon Lavochkin had ambitious swept-wing projects. If those projects failed, the military would still have a reliable backup plan. However, Yakovlev understood the competitive environment. If his competitor succeeded, his design bureau would lose its edge and be sidelined. To avoid this, he decided to develop two fighters in parallel. The first one, the Yak-23, strictly followed all the requirements handed down by the government. But the second airplane was the lighter and more maneuverable Yak-23. It was developed as an unofficial in-house project. For a long time, ministry leadership had no idea that work on this fighter was happening. The design of the Yak-23 was based on the layout of the Yak-15 and Yak-17. However, unlike its predecessors, this new fighter was designed practically from scratch. It featured a completely new fuselage. The engineers also decided to equip the airplane with a newly profiled wing and modern flaps, which significantly improved its flight characteristics. The armament consisted of 23mm cannons. They were positioned differently than on previous models, located in the lower nose section of the aircraft, directly underneath the engine. The drafting of the fighter blueprints was done before the Soviet designers had seen the actual British engine. All the design work was done based on scale drawings. When the real engine was finally delivered, it fit into the finished airframe so well that the aircraft barely required any modifications. The Yak-23 did not keep its unofficial status for very long. Preparations began for the 1947 Tushino Air Show, and the Minister of the Aviation Industry issued an official order. Yakovlev had to finish building the Yak-23 by June 15th and complete all flight testing by July 30th. By June, assembly of the first prototype was successfully completed. A month later, this new fighter took to the skies for the first time. On August 3rd, it made its public debut during a major aerial review. At the controls was test pilot Mikhail Ivanov. He worked alongside the lead project engineers. Together, they completed the cycle of factory trials, which wrapped up on September 24th. During these flights, the fighter reached 503 knots at low altitude. At high altitudes, it displayed good aerodynamics, performing complex aerobatics. However, because of the accelerated schedule, the team did not have time to measure and record key technical specs. For instance, the engineers did not calibrate the airspeed indicator. The Yak-23 was handed over for state trials as quickly as possible. State trials for the new fighter began on November 11th using the second prototype. Meanwhile, the Design Bureau's experimental facility built another Yak-23 airframe exclusively for static strength testing. The test team was composed of a select group of highly experienced military and factory pilots, led by Chief Test Pilot Grigory Sedov. The evaluation board was impressed by the aircraft's low-altitude climb rate. To evaluate its combat potential, they flew mock engagements against the experimental Tu-12 jet bomber. These showed that the Yak-23 could engage the new generation of strike aircraft. The test pilots also evaluated its chances in hypothetical engagements against potential enemy fighters. However, these conclusions were largely based on comparisons with existing Soviet aircraft of the era. The final report noted that the Yak-23 outperformed the MiG-9 and Su-9 models across all key metrics. The only area where it fell short compared to the Su-9 was deceleration time in level flight. because the aircraft lacked speed brakes. Military experts consider this a major flaw that limited the fighter's combat maneuverability. There were other complaints about the design too. Pilots noted poor air-to-ground radio range, heavy control forces on the stick and rudder pedals, and the lack of a pressurized cockpit. Without pressurization, high-altitude flying became physically demanding. Despite these issues, the board's overall verdict was positive, and they recommended the new fighter for active service. This prototype story ended in a crash on July 14, 1948. This happened during a rehearsal for a massive aerial review over Tuscino. Fighters were making passes by the main grandstand one after another at an altitude of around 300 feet, while heavy bombers and transport aircraft flew overhead. An object struck the wing of Mikhail Ivanov's Yak-23 fighter at high speed. The force of the impact sheared off a section of the wing. The aircraft departed controlled flight and went into a spin. The G-forces ripped the canopy away, ejecting the pilot from his seat. Ivanov was killed upon impact with the ground. The crash investigation revealed that the fighter had been struck by a mass balance that had torn off the rudder of a Tu-14 bomber. This was confirmed when the bomber landed missing that part. Investigators also found paint transfer from the bomber on the wing of the Yak-23. However, the accident board could not determine how the debris took that trajectory, as the Tu-14 was flying significantly higher, further ahead, and off to the side of the Yak-23. Following the crash, the decision to put the Yak-23 into full-rate production was delayed by nearly a year. Most likely, Soviet command was hesitating due to flaws uncovered during state trials. On top of that, the new Yak-25 made its maiden flight in November 1947. It outperformed its predecessor in almost every metric, and it featured a pressurized cockpit. In 1948, flight testing began for two experimental fighters. These were the I-310, soon to be known as the MiG-15, and the Model 174, the future La-15. These aircraft demonstrated the advantages of the swept-wing design. At the time, the arrival of these competitors led to doubts about the future of the straight-winged Yak-23. However, by the end of that same year, the Soviet government decided to approve the Yak-23 for serial production. Both the MiG-15 and the La-15 were experiencing teething issues during early production. Resolving those issues would take time. The Yak-23, on the other hand, was a proven and reliable airframe. In February 1949, production of the Yak-23 started at the aviation plant in Tbilisi. Previously, the facility had been building its predecessor, the Yak-17. Halfway through the year, leadership considered retooling the plant to handle full-rate production of the MiG-15 instead. Although they scrapped that idea by August, momentum for the Yak-23 production had stalled. This meant the first production fighters did not roll off the assembly line until October. By the end of 1950, the factory in Tbilisi built a total of 310 of these aircraft. They were powered by the RD-500 turbojet, an unlicensed Soviet copy of the British Rolls-Royce Derwent 5 engine, producing roughly 3,500 pounds of thrust. Between March and June 1950, the first production models underwent military acceptance trials at an airfield in the North Caucasus, near the city of Grozny. The fighter was built for dogfighting at low and medium altitudes. Overall, pilots reported positively on the jet, noting the climb rate and maneuverability. Its ease of maintenance was a plus, as was the ability of the fighter to operate from unpaved airstrips. The design was not without operational issues. The emergency canopy release mechanism would occasionally fail, and engine smoke would sometimes enter the cockpit. As the Yak-23 saw more operational service, two more serious issues became apparent. First, as it approached Mach 0.8, the aircraft would start yawing severely, causing a loss of directional stability. Second, rapidly advancing the throttle would cause the fighter to pitch up. They never managed to fix that last flaw, as it was tied to the basic aerodynamic design of the airframe. Within the Soviet Union itself, the Yak-23 did not see widespread use. Most of the airframes built were assigned to a few fighter regiments located in the North Caucasus and the Volga region. Interestingly, one production model was used in an experimental program. Engineers conducted ground tests to evaluate towing the fighter behind a Tu-2 bomber. Later on, they flight tested this concept but used a different fighter prototype, the Yak-25, towed behind a B-25 Mitchell bomber. The majority of Yak-23s built eventually went to countries within the Soviet sphere of influence. Abroad, the jet contributed to establishing their early jet air forces. One of the largest foreign operators of the jet was Poland. The first of these fighters arrived in December 1950. By 1953, the Polish Air Force had received over 100 Yak-23s. Some of them were not new, having already seen operational use in the Soviet Union. The first batches were delivered disassembled, hidden inside shipping containers, and moved by ground transport to Poland's Bemowo airfield. Soviet engineers reassembled the aircraft, sharing their technical expertise with Polish mechanics. The initial test flights of these assembled fighters were handled by Soviet pilots. To train their own personnel, 12 Polish pilots were sent to the Soviet Union in January 1951. There, they went through a conversion course on two-seat Yak-17 trainers. After that, part of the group stayed behind to train on the new Yak-23, while the rest returned home to continue training under visiting Soviet instructors. These Polish pilots became instructors themselves, starting the jet training program for their Air Force. The public first saw these jets on August 26, 1951. During the Aviation Day celebrations at Warsaw's Okisi Airfield, a formation of Yak-23s flew over the grandstands, while veteran Polish pilots performed aerobatics in the jets. In September, several fighter squadrons went on operational alert. As deliveries continued, pilots from different fighter regiments gradually mastered the Yak-23. Additionally, at least 13 of these jets were handed over to the Officers' Aviation School in Radom to train student pilots. The Polish Air Force used the Yak-23 mainly for air defense. Thanks to its climb rate, the jet was used for intercepting airspace intruders. The pilots spoke highly of the fighter. One Polish pilot recalled that the Yak-23 was very maneuverable. Taking advantage of the high thrust-to-weight ratio, pilots would often retract the landing gear as soon as they broke ground, instead of waiting to reach a safe altitude like the flight manual dictated. Another advantage of the Yak-23 was its rough field performance, with records noting successful forced landings on unpaved surfaces. In one episode, a Polish cadet managed to safely put the jet down on a local grass strip. When the squadron commander arrived at the scene, he inspected the fighter and then took off in it from that same field. Historical records note one fatal crash involving a Yak-23 in the Polish Air Force. It happened on September 15, 1953, when a Polish aircraft crossed into Czechoslovakian airspace. It is possible there was a flight control failure or the pilot suffered G-lock. Either way, the fighter went into a vertical dive and impacted the terrain, killing the pilot. The aircraft were phased out of frontline units by the mid-1950s, but the training center kept flying them until the fall of 1957. A couple of demilitarized airframes were later transferred to the Warsaw Institute of Aviation for research purposes. One of them became a parts donor. The second airframe saw heavy use and was useful for developing aerodynamic flight test methods. By the fall of 1957, this fighter was modified to set aviation records. On September 21st, test pilot Andrzej Ablamovich set 2 international time to climb records in it. He reached an altitude of 3,000 meters in 119 seconds and then reached the 6,000-meter mark in 197 seconds. This specific airframe kept flying until the end of November 1961. The Polish government considered setting up licensed production of the Yak-23 at aviation plants in Mielec and Swidnik. One plant would manufacture the forward fuselage, while the other plant would build the rest of the airframe and handle final assembly. The engines would be supplied by the Soviet Union. Engineers received a Soviet fighter to use as a reference. They drafted blueprints, prepared factory equipment, and manufactured the first batch of parts. However, the Yak-23 project was canceled in favor of the MiG-15. Czechoslovakia had similar plans for serial production of the Yak-23, but these remained on paper. The number of airframes delivered from the Soviet Union was relatively small. The first batch of 12 disassembled aircraft arrived in shipping crates at a Czechoslovak airbase in late 1950. They were later joined by 9 more fighters. A Czechoslovak squadron transitioned to the new jets. They had previously been flying S-92 fighters, which the Czechs had built after World War II using parts from German Me-262s. In the fall of 1951, the designated S-101s were handed over to an aviation regiment initially based in Malata, which later relocated to the Zetek Air Base. These fighters also flew patrols out of Cheb Airfield. The pilots intercepted intruding aircraft and reconnaissance balloons launched from West Germany. These balloons were considered a hazard for air traffic. Czechoslovak pilots intercepted and shot down several of them. In October 1952, a fatal crash of a Czech Yak-23 occurred near Zetek Air Base. After takeoff, the pilot maneuvered into a steep turn, bleeding off airspeed. The aircraft entered a stall, and with insufficient altitude remaining, the pilot was unable to recover. Following the crash, the remaining fighters were transferred to another unit. In the summer of 1953, another pilot lost directional control during landing and veered off the runway. The airframe was damaged beyond repair, but the pilot was uninjured. These jets finished their service with the Czechoslovak Air Force in 1956. Bulgaria received its first 12 Yak-23s in 1951. Eventually, the total number of these fighters in Bulgarian service reached over 100 airframes. Unconfirmed reports suggested Bulgarian engineers attempted to develop a two-seat trainer variant of the Yak-23. The aircraft went to an air regiment stationed at Graf Ignatievo Air Base. Training flights began in mid-summer. During one takeoff, a Yak-23 suffered an engine failure. The pilot executed an emergency landing in a nearby field without injury. These jets were displayed during the May Day parade on May 1, 1952. During the event, flights of Yak-23s and MiG-15s made a pass over Sofia at an altitude of about 1,000 feet. For the flyover, pilots holding the rank of major were selected. Around the time of the event, they received consecutive rank promotions. These aircraft operated with several fighter squadrons and were used to train cadets at the Georgy Benkovsky Air Force Academy. The Bulgarian Yak-23s intercepted foreign aircraft entering the country's airspace. Reconnaissance balloons were also targeted by the Air Defense Network. These fighters stayed in service with Bulgaria until 1958. In 1951, Romania received an initial batch of 12 Yak-23s, acquiring around 40 of these fighters in total. They were used to equip several fighter regiments. One Romanian pilot successfully qualified on the new aircraft, marking the beginning of their operational use. Romanian Yak-23s were used to intercept airspace intruders. Historical records note a successful interception executed by a Romanian pilot in difficult weather conditions. The Yak-23s were retired by the late 50s. Hungary and Albania received Yak-23s in 1950 and 1951, operating them for several years. Albania received a portion of its Yak-23s and spare parts from Poland. According to Polish historian Andrzej Glas, one Albanian Yak-23 shipment transported by rail through Yugoslavia was subject to a clandestine operation. The aircraft were disassembled, packed into crates, and loaded onto 20 rail cars. When the Albanian representatives arrived, only 19 rail cars remained. 2 months later, the missing rail car reappeared. It had been diverted by U.S. intelligence, who shipped the disassembled Yak-23 to the United States. Specialists reassembled and tested it at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, then dismantled and returned it to Yugoslavia undetected. Several Yak-23s are preserved in museum collections. In Russia, the single-seat version is on display at the Monino Aviation Museum, while the Yakovlev Design Bureau preserves the sole two-seat trainer variant. This variant was shown to the public at Kodynka Field in August 1993. Poland has 5 preserved Yak-23s, including at the Polish Army Museum in Warsaw and the Polish Aviation Museum in Krakow. In the Czech Republic, the fighters at the Aviation Museum at the Kabeli Airport in Prague. In Romania, an example is on display at the Otopeni Airport. In Bulgaria, 3 aircraft are at the Air Force Museum in Plovdiv. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video and making it all the way to the very end. I truly appreciate all of your continued support. We are rapidly approaching 4,500 subscribers on the channel right now, and I am just so incredibly happy and deeply grateful for each and every one of you. Building this amazing aviation community together means the absolute world to me. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the history of the Yak-23, please let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you have not already, so you do not miss out on any of our future historical aviation documentaries. Stay safe, keep looking up at the skies, and I will see you all in the very next episode.